Hello, I'm Dr. Margie LaCoultry, former principal in the Knoxville City and Knox County School System, and today is November the 2nd, 2010, and we're filming this interview at the Andrew Johnson Building in Knoxville, Tennessee. It's a privilege this morning to have a conversation with Emma Jean Huddleston, who was formerly a teacher, a guidance counselor, and a principal in the Knoxville City School System. So, Emma Jean, we'll just get started, and you tell us where did you grow up, and then you can tell us about your educational background.
Well, I grew up in Knoxville. I was the only child of Robert Lewis Leake and Bertie Leake. My daddy and mother did not finish school. Daddy went through the 4th grade, mother went through the 8th grade. But Daddy had a market in the old market house.
I remember that.
And so he was... he ran his business, so he was a smart man. Mm-hmm. But they both wanted me very much to go to college. And when I entered high school, I really thought that I wanted to go into the field of medicine because I very much admired the lady who was the nurse to my doctor. But when I got up to taking chemistry, and I could not solve, you had to... they gave you chemicals and you had to break them down.
Right.
And after many, many tries, I didn't figure out that I had salt, just NaCl. So I decided that the medical field was not for me. So I had a teacher, Pace Moore Johnston, in high school. She taught Latin. And we used to say if she had just been a general in the Second World War, we would have won much, much more quickly.
But she was your hero.
But she was a hero, and she was a role model. Mm-hmm. And I remember that during that time, there used to be a program on the radio, because we didn't have TV, on the radio. Can't remember what it was called now. But anyway, it was students, and one of the things they had was a contest to nominate your favorite teacher. So I did that. Now, she didn't win the contest, but I got a certificate to give to her. Mm-hmm. And I got to thinking, if I admire her that much, and this was, I guess, egotistical of me, wouldn't it be nice to be admired like that? So, and then I had another teacher that was instrumental in getting me nominated as a Delta Kappa Gamma scholarship recipient. Now, I didn't win that either, but at least I did go to the contest, and I was interviewed. But anyway, I went on to UT, and I...
Now, where did you go to elementary school?
In elementary school? Mm-hmm. Well, I started out at Westview Elementary, which is still in existence, and then we moved to the country. And I went to Ramsey Elementary School, which is no longer in existence.
But where was that located?
It was up at where Straw Plains and Thorngrove Pike split, and it was right in there. And, it was... Well, I think we did have some indoor bathrooms, but the outdoor one was still there. But we didn't have to use it. But we didn't have a cafeteria. You had to... Usually we walked down to the grocery store and got a bologna sandwich and a big orange cup. Dope,
Dope, that's right. Mm-hmm.
But anyway, and then I went to Central High School because I wanted to take Latin, and it was not offered at Carter. And so I went there 4 years till I graduated.
How did you get there?
I rode a Greyhound bus that came down Straw Plains Pike, and I could see it when it came down the top of the hill, and I could get out the front door and get down to the road and catch it. And I rode it into town to the Greyhound bus station, and then I got off, went up the steps, and went out in front of the old Knox department store.
Right there next to the station.
Caught it would be called the K-Trans bus
Right.
now, KTL bus or whatever it was called. But anyway, caught that transportation to Fountain City and got off there at the foot of the hill and walked up the hill to Central High School. And then in the afternoon, there were special buses that ran, and they brought us back in and let us off at where the jail was then, over on Broadway. And I walked over then to the corner where Rega's restaurant is, and the Greyhound bus came around the corner, and I caught it and went back home, and that was my transportation.
And if it rained?
If it rained, if it was raining really, really hard when we got to Fountain City, there was a little cab that ran, and 4 or 5 of us would pay. I think it took a quarter to ride up the hill.
Oh.
But most of the time, I mean, you had a raincoat and you had boots, and so we just
Made your way up.
made our way up the hill. And of course, we took great pride in Central High School because it was a good school. And of course, you know, we had the big rivalry with Knoxville High in football.
And Young High, too.
Yeah, I guess so, but the
remember
Knoxville High was the
big
big one that was played on Thanksgiving Day, and that was the only football game I ever got to go to, because we lived so far out in the country, and my daddy worked, and he couldn't, take me out to the ball game, but I did get to go to the Thanksgiving game because it was over at Neyland Stadium,
Oh, yes.
and so that was a very exciting thing to do. But then from Central, I did go to UT, and I got a BS degree in 1954, and I was going to major in English and French, and when I got started in French, I didn't do too well. And so, anyway, I switched over to an English and speech major.
Oh, okay.
And
That's
so
good.
I enjoyed doing that. But I never had the nerve. I was very fortunate to have had Dr. Paul Soper, who was went on to be the head of the Clarence Brown Theater and the Carousel Theater. And but I never had enough courage to try out for a part. So most of my experience in working in the theater was behind the scenes, working on the sets and changing the props and doing that sort of thing. But I really enjoyed it.
And it was a necessary thing. I mean, somebody
Yeah.
had to do that to make the play work well.
But I really think that it enabled me to be a good speaker. And most of the time, as I went on through life, my mother was the only one who would say, I can't hear what you're saying. So I think the speech major, and then I minored in sociology. And then after I got out of college, I applied for a teaching position, and I was selected by Miss Helan Brixey to teach at Christenberry Junior High School beginning in 1954. Now, I had been offered a position. I did my student teaching in Oak Ridge, and I was pleased. I mean, I thought that this at least showed that they were pleased with my teaching, that I was offered a position teaching out there. But in the meantime, my daddy had passed away, and I felt like since I was an only child that I was obligated to stay at home with my mother, which I did. And anyway,
Now, did you all move from the farm in at that time? You were here?
no, we were already in town by then, and we had sold the farm when I was a freshman in college, and had moved into Burlington and lived there for 3 years. Then we had moved to Fountain City, so that was where we lived when Daddy passed away. But anyway, I went to teaching in 54, and in 56 was when they were first bringing in guidance counselors. And so Miss Brixey assigned me to one period a day to be a guidance counselor, and we had 1,200 kids
My goodness.
at Christenberry. But anyway, so I went back to school and started working in the summers on taking some guidance courses, and that's how I got into working on the guidance. And some of the things I was making some more notes here that I remembered. When I started in 54, it was not uncommon to have 40 to 45 kids in a class. The first year I taught, the smallest class I had was 40, and my largest class was 45. And then
Is this in guidance, or is this the
no,
teaching
this was
position?
just teaching.
And
This,
what subject were you teaching?
well, I was teaching 7th grade English.
Oh, my goodness.
And
40 people.
40 people. And so, but anyway, the first year that you taught, the first semester, you got to be in a classroom. You weren't a quote unquote floating teacher. But the second semester, then you had to float. And sometimes I even remember having one class that met in as many as 3 different places. And I would always have to think, well, now this is Monday. Now where am I going on Monday? This is Tuesday. But I had a class that met on Monday and Wednesday in the auditorium. Now this is 7th grade English that you're teaching in the auditorium with a rolling chalkboard.
Right.
And books.
They don't have desks, right?
No desks. And then on Tuesday and Thursday, Christenberry was fortunate to have a what we call the clubhouse, which is still in existence, and it is now a historic site. And it was the band room. So I taught 7th grade English in the band room. And we had to go in and move all the instrument stands and again sit on a little folding chair with their notebooks on their lap. And they did not have their own textbooks, so we had to carry the textbooks out to the band room. And then on Friday we taught in the library. So, and that was sort of unusual to teach in that many places, but it was not at all uncommon every other semester to be a floating teacher. And that was not easy to do sometimes.
And that's because there's too many students.
Just too many students, just too many students for the classrooms. And sometimes you had all of these interruptions. I remember once I taught in a math classroom, but it was next to the wood shop.
Oh.
And so when you were giving out, having a spelling test, you'd start the spelling test, and then here'd go the bandsaw, zoom, you know,
Right.
and you'd have to wait a minute before you could give the next word. So I've had all kinds of amusing experiences in that respect.
Now that's the elementary school now, isn't it?
It is,
Christenberry.
yeah, yeah. They redid it as an elementary school, and I was so pleased that, other than fixing the Tupelo on the front of it, they've really kept the outside of the building in almost the same configuration that the old building was in, so it still looks like the junior high school.
Well, it's interesting how we've changed our different schools to be from one level to another, and they still function very well, so that's good.
And then after, in 1960, Whittle Springs Middle School, or it was junior high also then, opened. And Miss Brixey went there as principal, and she asked me to be one of the teachers there, and I had 2 periods of guidance there. And so in the meantime, I also kept on going to school to get my hours in guidance. And in 1964, I was chosen to be in we called it a guidance institute at UT, where you went for 10 weeks and you had all day, every day, 5 days a week, in an intensive training in guidance. And that was where I met my husband to be.
Oh, Mr.
And
Bill.
so, Mr. Bill, and in the spring of that year, he lived in Stevenson, Alabama, but he taught in Whitwell, Tennessee. And so in the spring of that year we married, but I didn't move to Stevenson until June because I needed to finish out my contract. And so I would teach all week and drive to Stevenson on the weekend and then come back on Sunday afternoon and teach the next week. So, but we were taking care of his mother, and that was the reason we couldn't move back to Knoxville. But after she passed away, then we did come back to Knoxville, and I was sent to Tyson to teach 7th grade English and be a guidance counselor. And my husband was sent to Austin East, where he was guidance counselor, and he taught, I think, 2 periods of government, and he stayed there until he retired. And then in 1971, our Gladson was the head of the guidance department, and so he chose me to go to Gresham when it opened, and it was still a junior high school then, as the head guidance counselor. So I went there as a full-time guidance counselor and stayed there 5 years, and in the meantime decided I wanted to go back and finish my administration hours. In fact, at one time I even had hoped I could do my doctorate, but at that time you had to take off a year, as you well know.
Yeah, I will know.
And so we just couldn't financially or otherwise afford to do that. So I just finished up the hours I needed. And I finally was chosen as a principal, and at that time, I can remember you telling me you were working on your dissertation, and that you told me that at the time that I was chosen, which was in 1978, and the reason I was chosen was because of Title IX, that they had to have a woman in the secondary position, and that when I was chosen as principal at Tyson Junior High School,
Junior high.
it was junior high at that point,
Uh-huh.
and that I was one of only 10 women in the whole state of Tennessee who was in a secondary position. Now, it doesn't mean that there hadn't been some to precede me, because Miss Gresham at Central, Miss Brixey
Right.
were secondary principals. Miss Doyle, of course, was still a superintendent. I think there were 3 lady superintendents, and then the other people were
In
principals.
79, that's true, across the
yeah.
state of Tennessee.
Yeah.
That's right.
But anyway, so that, but they got to the point where they had to have a principal. And I remember that Betty Hughes, who was my school nurse, did not know me at the time I was appointed. And when she found out that I was being sent to Tyson, which was not the easiest school to serve as principal, she said, "Oh, law," said, "they'll just tear that woman apart." But she said, "I was pleased when you came that they did not do that."
Right.
And I always felt like that I didn't want the children to be afraid of me, but I did want them to respect me.
Right, there's
and
a
I
difference.
think that that's what they did. After 4 years, then we were changed to a middle school. And then in 1984, after I had done my 30 years, I retired. And my husband had already retired in 78, and then he became ill and passed away in 85. So I did some substituting, and I even taught at Catholic for 10 weeks, and then I got sick, and my mother got sick, and so I just resigned from teaching. And after that, I went back and did some substituting. But I decided I wanted to work, but I didn't want to go
All the time.
all the time. Well, I didn't mind going every day to work, but I just didn't want to go back into education. So when you're 56 years old and you start applying for a job, not everybody is knocking on your door,
Well, that's
because
true.
they will tell you, "Oh, well, you're too highly educated,
Right, that's the main
or
thing.
you will want too much money. All these excuses, and but I answered a blind box ad in the paper that wanted a counselor in a rehabilitation program. So I answered the ad, and it turned out to be at Goodwill Industries here in Knoxville. And they had a program in which you would be working with high school students who would go into training programs at Goodwill in order to enable them to go out in the community and get a job. And so I began there in September of 1988. And I worked in that program until June of 89, and then, as government grants will do, the grant ran out.
Oh, yes.
So they had another position open as a volunteer coordinator, but it wasn't a full-time position. And I said, well, that's all right, because my mother was still living, and I was in other kinds of activities. I said, that's fine. And they sort of let me
Make your own program.
make my own program and make my own hours and so forth. And so I did all kinds of things. I did fashion shows and scarf tying shows, and I went out and talked to senior citizens groups about Goodwill and what they did, and then coordinated volunteers who came in and worked. We did a doll show, we did book sales, all different kinds of things. So,
Well, let's look at just a minute. Let's go back and when you started your teaching and coming to or even to today, do you see very many differences in education?
yes, I do. I really do. For one, class sizes are not as big.
Thank goodness.
And yes, thank goodness. And at that point in time, there was only one principal. Even when I became principal, I was it.
Right.
Before I retired, I did get one assistant, but now they may have as many as 3 or 4 assistants or other kinds of helpers.
That's true, they do.
I was expected to attend all the school sporting events, and I remember, and I think they still do this, but I remember actually physically going to county commission meetings, to city council meetings, asking for funds. And I remember, I think you've already interviewed Paul Kelly, but one of the things that his wife and I would do is go with him when he went to county commission meeting, and he was trying to convince the county commission to let the tax money go where the students are.
Right.
And he had 4 little teddy bears, and he would take the teddy bears and a ribbon, and he'd say, now, here's where all the children are. Let's put the ribbon across here, and that's where the funds ought to be divided. And we never did really get what we wanted, but it was such an interesting thing.
Way to put it.
And I would always have to hold Norma's hand because she was afraid Paul was going to be fired, but by having to go up and do that. Differences I see. I watched the most interesting TV program on Channel 2 the other night about the schools in San Francisco. And they are starting with their kindergarten children in different kinds of schools. There was a Cantonese school where when they go in the very first day, everything's in Chinese. Mm-hmm. The teachers speak Chinese. They have to learn immediately, learn their name, learn to make the signatures in Chinese. There was one, a Cambodian school. There was a Spanish school. There were all these different kinds of schools. One of the things it pointed out was an older boy that he was learning Chinese, and he got to go to China and the person that he visited in China got to come back to America. And that Chinese child was so excited about coming to America because he would have a sibling.
Oh.
Because in China, you see, they can only have one child.
Right.
So he had never had a brother or sister. So
Well, we both can know what
so
that's
he
like.
was excited about that. I think that is a difference.
Tell me about a success that you've had that you enjoyed.
Well, I think for one thing, I enjoyed being a principal. I enjoyed all my teaching experiences, even though some of them might have been difficult. I had kids that turned out well and were well, like Leroy Thompson played football for Tyson, and he went on to be a NFL football player, and so that he was a success. I've had kids that I've been on Facebook a little bit, and I have a kid that has corresponded me from Paris, and he has been in Paris, and he plays the piano, and he played in Paris professionally until he said he decided that he was going to be in his later years. He was going to be more successful at earning money if he went into banking. Plus, he had found a girl that he wanted to marry, and they wanted to have a family. So he is now in banking in Paris.
I see.
So that was a success. I've had, I think, one thing that makes me feel good, I have so many of my teachers who still keep in contact with me, that one calls me at least once a month from Florida
That
to
is wonderful.
see that if I'm all right.
That's great.
And
Some
then
good bonding with
yeah,
those teachers.
that's right. And I think I did have good bonding. I thought that was a good thing. One of the good things that happened, and that I didn't know was happening, and I want to mention today, when I was at Whitwell was a little school. It was grades 7 through 12. I would imagine we might have had 300 or 400 children. Just no air conditioning, just no cafeteria, no nothing. Whitwell had 1,000 people in Whitwell, one traffic light. They're up to 2 traffic lights now.
Oh, they're improving.
But there are more people. This book, 6 Million Paper Clips,
I remember
is
something
about a project that they took on of studying the Holocaust. And there is a movie that has been made, and it's a documentary, and it's just called Paper Clips. And, but it talks about that this little rural town of now 1,600, and whose population is mostly white and Protestant, is an unlikely place for a Holocaust memorial. But today, a World War II era German rail car sits in front of Whitwell Middle School, housing millions of paper clips, with each one honoring a victim of Nazi hatred and murder. And that just gives me cold chills and this book tells all about how they got the rail car and what they did with it, and what I'm so proud of is these children at Whitwell have now become docents of the museum, so that if you go to visit the museum, they're the ones who take you through and explain what it is. And this was such a wonderful thing. And then I remember going to see the movie. It was at the West Knoxville Theater, and I was the only one in there.
Well, we're hearing a lot about our history not focusing on those kinds of things. And it did happen, and you can't
deny it.
That's right. So I'm glad to see that little group working with that too. That's very
well.
positive.
It makes me feel so good because the lady who headed this up, the principal who headed this up, was one of my husband's students, And I understand that she's going to be in Knoxville at some time soon. I can't find out when or where. Her name is Linda Hooper, but anybody who has a chance to go see and hear her certainly ought to do that. But since I have quit teaching, I can't just quit.
No.
And so I have been in two positions now where I have served as a social activities director in a senior citizens facility. And I've enjoyed that. Sometimes I feel like it all falls on my shoulders, but maybe I'm...
If you had an opportunity to do it all over again, would you do it?
Yeah, I would.
So it's where you needed to be with your life.
Yeah, and it wasn't a matter of, if I had been able to figure out what salt was and had finished chemistry, I might have gone into the medical field, and I certainly would have made more money. Because I can remember my first year, 1954, my salary for the year was $2,700 and I think $64
for the year. Well, of course, there were a lot of things, housing and everything was different and not as expensive and all that.
True.
But as we look back on it from where we retired, that makes a difference. Well, Imogene, do you have anything else you'd like to say to the group? This is a history thing, and people will research and use your information in some of the things they're putting together about way back there. So what you've said today has been most helpful.
Well, I just think that anyone who is interested in education, anyone who wants to become an educator, it is certainly a rewarding field. I don't think you'll ever regret it. I would hope, though, if you get into it and you don't like it, get out of it.
Well, that's true.
Because so I have seen so many times through my career, both as a teacher and as an administrator, people who got into it, they really didn't like it, but they didn't know how to get out of it.
And they were all tied into the monies.
Yeah.
And all of that.
Yeah.
So that's true. That's a good point. But if you do like it, you're in the right place.
That's right.
And the children
That's
will love
right.
you.
That's exactly right. And I don't know that I've got anything else to offer. I think I've told
about everything.
Amusing things, and I'm sure there's a lot more that you can think of kids that you've worked with who are. One thing, when I was principal, we were allowed to whoop, and so I still run across boys who will say, "Oh, Miss Huddleston, you sure could whoop good." Now, my extent of whooping was this. In the first place, my office at Tyson was so small, and I always sat down to whoop. And when I swung my paddle back, it hit the wall. Mm-hmm. So you know that I didn't have much force.
Right.
They got 3 licks. They always first got the opportunity to say, I always said, "Would you like me to call your mother and daddy, or do you want a whooping?" "Oh, I want a whooping." So they got 3 licks. It could not have been very forceful. I don't think it hurt one of them.
Just the idea.
But usually 1 whooping was all they ever got.
Didn't come back again.
Didn't come back again.
Well, that's good.
And I do remember I had this one little boy that I knew his background, and that he had been whooped at home, mercilessly. And so when he came in, I really felt like he needed to be punished. And so I said, "You sit down right there." And I said, I always shut my door. I said, "I'm going to whip myself." He looked so funny. And I hit my leg 3 times so that whoever was in the outer office thought that he was getting a whipping. Mm-hmm. But I would not have touched that child because he had suffered.
Or paid for it already.
He had suffered enough, and but I never did see him again either.
Well, we really appreciate your time and all the time that you gave to the school system and the positive time, because you have been a positive force in the educational area. And we're very pleased to have you here today and to share all that you've shared.
Thank you.